very much for the invitation. I'm going to start just with a quick apology that I've been struggling with a cold, which has knocked me for six. It's a long time since I had a cold, so I'm not firing quite on all cylinders, but I hope what I've got to say is going to be intelligible. And what I'm going to try and do is, there we go. I want to try and explain why and how anarchism diverges from conventional theorizations of liberty, by which I mean Isaiah Berlin's idea of positive and negative freedom, and more recently, neo-republican concepts of freedom as non-domination. So I'm going to start with Berlin and use his discussion, or the discussion he has, or I'm putting him in relation to anarchism. I'm going to use that as a launch pad to clarify the anarchist objection to the neo-republican concept. And then in the final section, when we get to what I'm calling lawless freedom, I want to look at the implications of the anarchist concept and why it is that we can have freedom, or how it is that we can have freedom in the absence of law. Another little sort of caveat, I suppose, before I start, so that the texts are quite, the slides are quite text heavy. And the reason for that is because I'm interested in the overlaps, or thinking about the overlaps between the ideas, rather than trying to produce a kind of a common analytical frame. So it seems to me that anarchism speaks to the distinction that Berlin makes between freedom to and freedom from, so negative and positive freedom. But they don't discuss the concept in those terms. So what I've tried to do is to use the text to show the overlaps and the concerns that they have about the way in which Berlin constructs freedom. And then, as I say, once I've done that, I'll think about how that discussion, if you like, speaks to the neo-republican concept. So I'm going to start by looking at the concept of positive liberty and what anarchists have to say about positive freedom. And I want to start with positive liberty because it's the point at which I think there's some agreement between the anarchists and Isaiah Berlin. And the coincidence is their shared concern about the institutionalization of positive liberty and the construal of freedom as the participation in the determination of the common good. And both of them have Jean-Jacques Rousseau in their sights when they talk about this. So what I've done, I'm going to read the comments. I've put Berlin's comments on Rousseau alongside Berlin's to illustrate what I think is the convergence. And if you're not familiar with Bakunin, Michael Bakunin, he was one of the leading lights of 19th century, the 19th century anarchist movement. He's also a figure that Berlin was familiar with. So Bakunin features in one of Berlin's Russian essays alongside Alexander Herzen. And although Berlin finds much to admire in Bakunin, he compares him unfavorably to Herzen. Nevertheless, I think they're agreed about Rousseau and the institutionalization of positive liberty and the threat that it presents to individual freedom. So Berlin says, and this is in the version that was produced for the Clarendon Press, and I think it's not in all of the abridged versions. And he's sort of focusing on the problem of positive freedom. And he says the French Revolution was an eruption of the desire for positive freedom of collective self-direction on the part of a large body of Frenchmen who felt liberated as a nation, even though the result was, for a good many of them, severe restriction of individual freedoms. Rousseau had spoken exultantly of the fact that the laws of liberty might prove to be more austere than the yoke of tyranny. Tyranny is service to human masters. The laws cannot be a tyrant. Does not mean by liberty the negative freedom of the individual not to be interfered with within a defined area, but the possession by all, the fully qualified members of a society, of a share in public power, which is entitled to interfere with every aspect of every citizen's life. The liberals of the first half of the 19th century foresaw that liberty in this positive sense could easily destroy every negative liberty they held sacred. Okay, now Bakunin talks in a very different kind of temper, I suppose, but the ideas are pretty much are very similar, it seems to me. And Bakunin says, this is in an extract, it's often called Rousseau's theory of the state. And he says, one might rejoin that the state, representing as it does the public welfare or the common interest of all, curtails a part of the liberty of each only for the sake of assuring to him all of the remainder. But this remainder may be the form of security, it is never liberty. But one might say, could the state, the democratic state, based upon the free suffrage of all its citizens, be the negation of their liberty? And why not? That would depend entirely on the mission and the power that the citizens surrendered to the state. A republican state based upon universal suffrage could be very despotic, more despotic even than the monarchical state, if under the pretext of representing everybody's will, it were to bring down the weight of its collective power upon the will and the free movement of each of its members. So the concern that both express about positive liberty, if we're thinking of it in Berlin's terms, is the possible repressiveness of the law to constrain the individual's freedom, and that they share in common. But Berlin calls that positive liberty, and Bakunin calls it the state, as we'll see. So they agree in terms about the problem of liberty in the state. They disagree about what Berlin calls negative liberty, or the freedom from. So the divergence turns on the relationship between political liberty and what Berlin calls economic slavery, or the inequalities that negative liberty allows. So Berlin's argument is that the guarantee of equal rights defines the scope of freedom, and the resources required to achieve individual goals are not relevant to considerations of liberty. They might be germane to the kinds of life that you lead, but they're not actually constraints on freedom. So he says, I am normally said to be free to the degree to which no human being interferes with my activity. Political liberty is simply the area within which a man can do what he wants. If I am prevented by other people from doing what I want, I am to that degree unfree. And if the area within which I can do what I want is contracted by other men beyond a certain minimum, I can be described as being coerced, or it may be enslaved. Coercion implies the deliberate interference of other human beings. You lack political liberty or freedom only if you are prevented from attaining your goal by human beings. Mere incapacity to attain your goal is not lack of political freedom. This is brought about by the use of such modern expressions as economic freedom and its counterpart, economic slavery. So inequalities, may be objectionable for many reasons, but you can't call them constraints on freedom. Because they're not deliberate interferences by other human beings, according to Berlin. So to illustrate the difference, I want to use Emma Goldman's commentary on The Open Road. And Emma Goldman, if you're not familiar with her, was a sort of a couple of generations after Bakunin, and became one of the great sort of organisers in the American anarchist movement. And I suppose has been resurrected in recent years as an anarchist feminist, which I think she was. But I think that framing of her tends to sort of narrow the focus of analysis in a way. And I think there are plenty of other things that she had to say which are interesting. And this commentary on The Open Road, I think, is one of them. And she writes this in her journal, Mother Earth, just as she's beginning a tour of America. And she's the reference is to Walt Whitman. And she says, the road, the open road, what a grand inspiration it gave to the grey poet. What wonderful vistas it disclosed to him of space, colour, beauty, opportunity, wisdom. All that and more. The open road meant to all those who, like Whitman, could walk along the open road, strong-limbed, careless, childlike, full of the joy of life, carrying the message of liberty, the gladness of human comradeship. But what of society's outcasts, the tramps, the homeless, shelterless, worn and weary? Does it not rather mean to them a desert, cold, dreary, aimless, hated and feared, everywhere hounded, hungry, wretched, with bleeding feet, walking, walking, walking? Can the road inspire them to great deeds and liberating thoughts? So I think what she's doing, I mean, it's a straight rejection of Berlin, but in unusual terms, because although, I mean, Goldman had plenty to say about economic slavery and wage slavery and the relationship between wage slavery and chattel slavery, what she does here is sort of change the terms of the debate entirely, and in challenging the adequacy of the concept of non-interference. What she's pointing to, I think, in this extract is the extent to which the lack of constraint or negative liberty actually also entails compulsion. I'm not sure where my slides have gone.
They seem to have disappeared, yeah. Might be best to try.
Yeah, can you try sharing your screen again?
Yeah. The sharing seems to have stopped. Right, let's hang on. Sorry about that. Right, let's whiz through these. Okay, can you see those again now?
Yep.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so yeah, the point I was trying to make is I think that what Goldman tries to point out is that the freedom from that Berlin wants to defend also comes with it degrees of compulsion which affect different groups of people in different ways. So the idea of being unconstrained actually can also involve compulsion. That's the point. So what are the roots of the disagreement? Well, the roots of the disagreement, it seems to me, come from the way in which anarchists and Berlin differently understand the relationship between property and the state, and the way in which the state is constituted in order to defend property. So whereas Berlin links illiberalism, or the threat to negative liberty, with the imposition illiberalism, a threat to negative liberty with the imposition of law, anarchists argue that negative liberty relies on exactly the same legal instruments. So what we're talking about is not the different character of freedom, negative or positive. What we're talking about is the ways in which any freedoms are upheld or defended in the state. So the anarchists actually, I mean, in this sort of diagnosis of the problem, the anarchists do agree with Rousseau. They don't agree with his solution, but they certainly think that he is right, that the foundations of the state lie in the defence of property. And this is what he says in The Origin on the Discourse on Equality. He says the first person who, having enclosed a plot of land, took it into his head to say, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. And he makes the same point in a slightly different way in On the Social Contract, when he says the right of first occupier, the right of first occupation, becomes a real right only when the right of property has already been established. Well, the right of property can only be established by positive law, that is, by the state. So the negative freedoms that Berlin wants to defend have the same underpinning as the positive freedoms that he thinks are a threat to tyranny. So the conversation that the anarchists are having with Berlin is not about the type of freedom we're talking about, it's about its institutionalization. So whereas Berlin wants to fence off negative liberty from considerations of law, anarchists bring the law back in and say you can't have negative liberty, you can't have those rights unless you actually defend the law, and if you're defending the law then you're interfering in people's lives in ways that are potentially tyrannous. So how then do anarchists stand in respect of the neo-republican critique of Berlin? So I think, you know, just as a background, the debate between the proponents of negative liberty and neo-republican freedom have largely been focused on the scope of negative liberty, what it includes, and for the defenders of neo-republican liberty. The problem of negative liberty is it doesn't recognise the possibility that individuals can be constrained by arbitrary decisions as well as by physical interference. So that's the kind of the theoretical dispute. In anarchism, this focus changes quite considerably. So the critique that anarchism has, I think, of neo-republican freedom is the same critique pretty much as the critique of liberalism, that basically neo-republicans suggest that they have a concept of non-domination at the heart of their thinking about freedom. But what they do is that they institutionalize it in the same ways as liberals. So the claim that I think is relevant to anarchism is the claim that Philip Pettit makes in his defense of freedom as non-domination, where he defines republican freedom as being negative in the sense that it does not have it's not determined by any kind of a particular ideological preference. So negative freedom as non-domination is consistent with a feminist perspective, a green perspective, a socialist perspective, a liberal perspective. It has no sort of prejudices, if you like. It has no baggage that comes with it. It's simply about determining which institutions do best by freedom. So what kinds of arrangements should we put in place? What kinds of political arrangements should we put in place in order to reduce the scope or the risk of arbitrary decision making? Anarchists use the same language of non-domination to think about the problem of freedom and the risks, if you like, that other people's decisions can make to our own enjoyment of liberty. But what they say is that if we're going to be serious about thinking about the institutions that do best by liberty, then we really have to empty our thinking of any kind of institution before we start. We can't have background conditions, in other words. And what they accuse the neo-republicans of doing is basically building property and the state back into the consideration of freedom. So it's impossible, according to the neo-republican conception of non-domination, to think about what a non-dominating society would be in the absence of law and in the absence of property in the state. So Philip Pettit says the state is like gravity or the laws of physics. Private property is akin to the natural environment. And that's the point where, in theory, anarchists will diverge from advocates of neo-republican freedom, because what they say is that anarchy, in real life, of course, we have all kinds of baggage and moralizations and social practices and norms which will be constraining of freedom. But if we're going to try and theorize what non-domination is, we have to try and distance ourselves from any precepts that are going to structure that concept of liberty before we start. And if we introduce the state and property as background conditions into that, then we're doing precisely the opposite. So the anarchist view is that Republican concepts of non-domination are incapable of doing what they set out to do, i.e. present a truly negative concept of freedom, because they start off with basic decisions about, or with preferences about the basic structure of society. So those questions about freedom have already been answered before you start. So what I want to do in the last part is to briefly try and flesh out some of the implications of the critique and what it is that anarchists think about when they think about freedom and the constraints on freedom and combating the constraints on freedom, how it is we should think about freedom. So I'm going to start with Tolstoy. And I'm starting with Tolstoy because I think he's just incredibly clear. But he's also, I think, a lot of what Tolstoy has to say echoes the anarchism of P.J. Proudhon, the man who in 1840, first calls himself an anarchist in a positive sense and asks the question, what is property, and comes up with the answer: property is theft. And exactly using using exactly the same language as the neo-republicans. And indeed of replicating some of the language of Berlin. I mean, Tolstoy talks of freedom, or the constraints on freedom, as types of slavery. And in the essay The Slavery of Our Times, he says that, in institutional terms, the constraints that we have on freedom, our slavery, our current slavery, our modern slavery, comes from the enforcement of laws about land, taxes and property. And you cannot begin to think about what enjoying freedom is for as long as you defend those institutions. The second thing he has to say, which again is a very sort of is a typically anarchist view, if you like, of the problem of freedom, is to think about the complexities of the moral orders that the law conceals. And to illustrate this, I've got a section from his novel Resurrection, and there's a testy exchange in the book. I mean, the book is largely about crime and punishment and the Russian prison system, but there's an exchange in the book between the hero Nekhludoff and his hated brother-in-law Rogozinsky, and they're talking about the rights and wrongs of law. And Rogozinsky, who is a lawyer, he admits the possibility that you can have judicial error, you could have miscarriages of justice, but he wants to defend the basic principle of the neutrality and the fairness of law. And he says, every thief knows that stealing is wrong and that we should not steal, that it is immoral, said Rogozinsky, with quiet, self-assured, slightly contemptuous smile, which specially irritated Nekhludoff. No, he does not know it. They say to him, don't steal, and he knows that the master of the factory steals his labour by keeping down his wages, that the government, through all its officials, robs him continually by taxation. Why, that is anarchism, Rogozinsky says, quietly defining his brother-in-law's words. And the point that Tolstoy is making, which is, as I say, a sort of a fundamental kind of precept of anarchism, is that as soon as you introduce law, what you're doing is you're introducing a kind of a fixed moral code, and that fixed moral code can never be neutral. It's always going to reflect the kinds of the norms and the prejudices that exist in any kind of social setting, in any kind of social organisation. And for as long as law exists, and as long as you have permanent fixed authority, which will use that law in order to define what your freedoms or unfreedoms are going to be, then you're going to be trying to, you're inevitably going to be benefiting or privileging a certain moral outlook. And the point of anarchy is to try and resist that permanence, is to try and make rules and norms much more fluid and much more sensitive to disagreement. So rather than think about defending freedom through law, which also entails violence, what anarchists want to do is to try and defend freedom by identifying where it is that freedom fails, and then trying to resolve the social differences that underpin those inequalities. So I've got two more slides before we finish. One is just to underline the point about the ways in which law not only affects fundamental economic inequalities, so the resources that people have in order to structure and realise their goals, but also the kinds of prejudices that feminists link to patriarchy, for example. So again, the person I'm looking at here is writing in the 19th century, Voltairine de Cleyre. She was a contemporary of Emma Goldman and was also active in America. And she's also someone who is very conscious of the fact that that law limits women's lives in particular ways, not just through the regulation of property, but also through the regulation of patriarchy. So she says, let woman ask herself, why am I the slave of man? Why is my brain said to be not the equal of his brain? Why is my work not paid equally with his? Why must my body be controlled by my husband? Why may he take my labour in the household, giving me in exchange what he deems fit? Why may he take my children from me, will them away while yet unborn? Let every woman ask. There are two reasons why, and these are ultimately reducible to a single principle: the authoritarian supreme power God idea. Its two instruments, the church, that is the priests, and the state, that is the legislators. So again, what she's doing is she's putting together the law and the moral codes, and pointing out the ways in which that conjunction of decision making, if you like, gets fixed in the state. And actually constrains people in extremely pernicious ways. So just to come back to this point about, well, you know, so how do you determine, or how do you begin to think about freedom in a condition of lawlessness? I want to end with an idea which I think is again a very sort of captures a very strong current in anarchist thinking, which is about how you respond to instances of non-domination, or instances of domination when they're pointed up to you. How do you respond to instances of unfreedom when groups who are marginalized and oppressed draw them to your attention? And the anarchist argument is that you're never going to get away from domination or instances of unfreedom, but the society that does best by freedom is the one that can respond to those constraints and those systemic inequalities quickly and peaceably. And this is the idea, I think, that's captured by Henry Nevinson, who was not an anarchist actually. He was but I think he was a fellow traveller, and he was a great friend of, or he was a friend of Emma Goldman's. He was a journalist, and he wrote quite a lot about freedom. And I really like this quote because I think it captures the sort of the uncertainties of freedom, and the idea that freedom is not a condition that we should try and build systems systems to regulate. It's actually a social process that we have to keep fighting for, and we have to keep we have to maintain our vigilance about. So he says, I can form no vivid conception of freedom apart from what I have seen. To me, the word conveys nothing as a natural right, nothing as an abstract idea, and nothing as a symbolic woman with wings blowing a trumpet into the ears of marble captives, decorately asleep in chains. I have learnt in the reality of the thing only from the misery of its opposite. And when I hear the word freedom, I see shaggy farmers, rough with mud and storm, or I see a woman in rags cowering under a ruined wall, or I see a pale man and girl hurried over the snow between brown-coated soldiers with fixed bayonets to be hacked to pieces in a barrack yard. Or I see black Africans huddled together upon a steamer's deck, gazing towards the misty islands where they will toil until they die in order that our chocolate creams may be cheap. It would take too long to tell you all the hideous examples of slavery, despotism, and injustice I have seen. It is only as a camp follower on the battlefield of freedom that I have learnt what freedom means. Freedom, as we know, is a thing that we have to conquer afresh for ourselves every day, like love. And we are always losing freedom, just as we are always losing love, because after each victory, we think we can now settle down and enjoy it without further risk or struggle. If we would keep love, or if we would keep love or freedom, we can never settle down. Okay, thank you.
Thank